Welcome to this week's Pluralia Dialogos, where I am very, very happy to be joined by two fantastic geopolitical analysts, Drago Bosnic, who is an editor and author at InfoBRICS and also a host at Lux Media, as well as Gardner, somebody who has been a regular guest on this platform many, many times, a good friend of Ed Lazansky, and somebody whose mind I've come to really respect and appreciate, especially in times of crisis, the likes of which we are living through. So welcome, everybody. And welcome to the audience. I'm looking forward to a very vibrant live discussion with the audience, who I'm sure have a lot of questions for you guys. But thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
So we're going to jump right into something that I think is on everybody's mind. A few days ago, the BRICS summit, the 17th BRICS summit, had just passed in Brazil. I'm getting personally a lot of contrarian messaging, whether or not this was a success, whether or not there was indications of cracks in the BRICS. I know a lot of people who tend to promote multipolarity put a lot of hope, as they should, as do I, in the BRICS emerging as a viable alternative to the collapsing hegemon of the transatlantic basket case. That being said, I find sometimes that the cheerleading gets a little bit loud and sometimes blemishes are too easily overlooked. We know that there was certain things like the absence of the physical persons of Putin, of Xi Jinping, the Iranian leadership didn't show up physically. I'd be curious to know if you guys think also that I think there were certain strange things remarked within the 17th declaration itself. But what, in your guys' assessment, I'll start with Drago here. You guys think that the BRICS summit overall was a success? Was it a failure? Was it something in between? What are the cracks, if any, in your mind right now, Drago?
Thank you. First of all, I want to say it's an honor and a privilege to be here, to be present. And I think you answered the question. There are certain cracks. I wouldn't call it a failure. I wouldn't call it like a massive success, but it was a success. And I think it shows that BRICS is not really dominated by Russia and China, as most people perceive. It is really a multipolar organization where various countries can present their own interests and promote them and so on. So there's no uniformity in BRICS. And of course, it should be noted that BRICS is not really, at least not yet, a geopolitical alliance. It's mostly economic. There's no one ideology that most members subscribe to. There's nothing that unites BRICS as much as the political West is united in the way that we see these blocs that are that dominate certain parts of the world or most of the world. So BRICS is a sort of a way to give countries an economic and financial alternative to the dollar-dominated system. And only in the last several years, BRICS has been able to project power in that regard. And that is also connected to the fact that the dollar is going down in widespread usage around the world. This doesn't mean it's going to collapse as the global reserve currency tomorrow or even in the next several years, but it is a process that's ongoing. And of course, we see that Trump has actually taken this very seriously, which is why he wants to maintain the dollar dominance. And as for the lack of, presence of Putin and Xi Jinping, and especially the Iranians, I think it's pretty clear why this happened. Interestingly, Trump is the one who's now pushing for more uniformity within BRICS, because he essentially offered support to the previous president Bolsonaro, who was essentially his ally in Brazil. And he doesn't really like Lula. At least this is the impression that I have. And as for the others, of course, as I said, the Iranians, their lack of presence is expected because Iran is going through a lot of trouble now. Much of their leadership, especially in the military and in the scientific sphere, has been eliminated during the clashes with the Israelis and the United States Air Force. This, of course, means that, one of the reasons that Iran was attacked was precisely this. It's sort of like a way to send a message to the rest of the world. Well, BRICS is not going to save you, or at least if you're a part of BRICS, it doesn't make you immune to attacks by the United States and its regional or any other allies. So BRICS is going through certain transformation. This should have happened like years ago, but obviously because of the way that it functions, there are certain problems and bureaucratic hurdles that need to be overcome. And of course, geopolitics is always involved in that, and it causes certain troubles that they're not easy to overcome. And there also needs to be a political will to do that. And in many countries, it's simply lacking. But again, as I said, we see certain progress, and I think it's going to continue. It's going to be incremental. There's not going to be anything groundbreaking, but there's certainly going to be some positive change.
Okay, thanks, Drago. Hall, you heard Drago's cautiously optimistic approach. He brought up also Iran being a newer member of the BRICS. That's obviously a factor behind a lot of the shenanigans that happened in the strangely worded 12-day war that just ended. Before I jump into, I know you've recently written an excellent, thorough essay on the U.S. and Israel versus Iran. But it was so much more than that. I'm gonna ask you some questions about that soon. But before that, straight off the bat, what is your assessment of the multipolar alliance, the BRICS in general, and is it strengthening? Is it moving in a good direction, or are there cracks you see?
My whole problem is the theoretical context. The concept of multipolarity to me is nonsensical. The problem is we're in an uneven polycentric world system in which the powers are totally uneven. And the effort after the breakup of the Soviet Union and effort of the U.S. to establish its so-called unipolar dominance in physics, it doesn't exist so far. At least they're trying to prove it. Anyway, the point is that the polarity implies tension, and yet we're trying to talk about bringing the BRICS together. And they have unequal interests, they have unequal power capabilities, and very different interests. So that already putting states together that already getting India and China into the same batch is an effort that is really important. I mean, I keeping those two powers from conflicting, which they did just a few years ago, quite significantly. And the point is that the concept of multipolarity, in my view, should be rejected to other perspectives. There's just simply, it implies tension. The whole neo-realist school, as much as I admire John Mersheimer, implies tension between states when what we need is consensus and cooperation. And the very term multipolarity for me implies that kind of conflict. So that's my first point there on a theoretical level. And the other things is simply, I think it's correct that the BRICS is not a military alliance; it's more of a political alliance. But I would emphasize the point that China sees it as a way to build the Belt and Road Initiative and to develop a larger global infrastructure. So I think and bringing Russia into that global infrastructure and all the other states is very important for the Chinese. And the fact that Xi Jinping didn't go sounds to me. I mean, he may have had other alternatives, but he could have made a video presence. I assume he did not. So anyway, I think that was a significant aspect of the recent conference. On the other hand, it is showing the United States there are other ways to organize the world system. And in my view, the United States should get smart and start looking at ways to deal with the BRICS Plus, and also even the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Mm-hmm. Mark Rubio recently said some remarks. I'm going to just play it here on the screen and get your thoughts on this. Mark Rubio, not somebody who is really renowned for being a peacemaker, a diplomat, or a lover of harmony, but yet he's been using words which I think many people who support the idea of war avoidance cooperation tend to admire those words. But is there something in how he's thinking about the words he's using, and I'd like to get your guys' take on this, that is off or dishonest in your minds? And here's the little message that I just pulled up from his remarks during the ASEAN summit.
Japan, South Korea, and India. And we've repeated that meeting numerous times since then with that group and attention to others. We have a running internal joke with my counterpart from Japan. I have literally now seen him about 8 to 12 times, and our joke is that we see each other more than we see our own families. And so these engagements are very important to us, and we're going to continue to stay very committed, because this, as I said to all of our partners, that this notion or idea that the United States would ever be distracted by the Indo-Pacific or even Southeast Asia is impossible. You can't be just, maybe it doesn't always, wars get more attention, but it's impossible to not be focused. This is where much of the story of the 21st century is going to be written. This is where 2/3 of economic growth is going to happen over the next 25 or 30 years. And many of the countries in Southeast Asia, not only are they some of the youngest countries in the world, but they're about to see an enormous expansion of their labor markets, their labor pool, number of workers. This is a historic, once-in-a-generation opportunity, not just for these countries to revolutionize themselves from an economic standpoint, but further strengthen our relationship. We have over 6,000 American companies that have invested heavily in these economies over the last 20 or 30 years. We're not abandoning those relationships. On the contrary, we want to strengthen and build upon them.
So are these the words of like a neo-crusader who has reformed his ways and now wants economic progress and growth? Or do you guys think that there's something more problematic in how he's thinking about it, the issue of the 21st century Asian-driven economy and world? Maybe Drago, I'll ask you first.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, to me, it's impossible for me to ignore the geopolitical aspects. I'm sure there is some economic interest, but it's impossible not to think about the so-called cordon sanitaire that they want to build around China, and especially mentioning these countries from India to Japan. The Quad comes to mind. In essence, the U.S. doesn't have the capacity to offer these countries more than what China can, especially because China is actually a production economy, and the U.S. is mostly dominated by these financial elites that want to exploit other countries. So, yeah, the Chinese might offer things, where you could end up in some debt or something, but there are ways to ameliorate that. And the problem is the U.S. wants to use these countries as a way to push them against China. And of course, it's not in the interest of these countries to go into confrontation with China because they can't win. The Chinese are just too powerful. They have technological and economic power that these countries cannot match in any way or form. I mean, India still has a lot of issues. India essentially wants to establish closer ties with China, and especially in terms of economy. They do have these issues, with territorial disputes, but these are issues that could be resolved, or they could at least be kept, in a sort of a status quo, like a frozen conflict of some kind, because fighting over some godforsaken place in the Himalayas is not more important than having actual economic cooperation. Is going to be mutually beneficial. On the other hand, if India or let's say Japan, or although Japan's sovereignty is rather limited, but let's say if India or these other countries in the region decide to become part of this so-called cordon sanitaire against China, then their fate is sealed. They will be forever like some sort of an Asian NATO against a far more powerful opponent than, let's say, the Soviet Union was, economically speaking, at least in the 1980s.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Hall, what do you think?
I tend to agree with that. I think the U.S. is trying to draw India out of its alliance, or at least its defense agreements with Russia, and use the tensions between India and China to break India away from China and to forge India into a new strategic relationship with Japan. And they do have military maneuvers with Japan and Australia in the form of, and linking this all up to the AUKUS Pact, the UK, American, Australian Pact, which is really in my view, a dangerously provocative pact from China's perspective, and linking India into that, and Japan if possible, as well as South Korea and all in supposed defense of Taiwan. Now, that's the real issue here, is this geostrategic alliance, when knowing that the economic benefits of working with China are better for the region than those as stated than really the American. Obama had failed to forge a new transatlantic, trans-Pacific pact before, and the U.S. really has had nothing to offer after Trump dumped the whole concept of a new transatlantic economic deal. Whether it would have worked or not is another question, but in my view, it could be reestablished in a way that incorporates some of Chinese interests rather than engaging in this dual containment, dual economic containment, and dual military strategic containment. And that means, get to the way, it's finding a compromise between Beijing and Taipei. And I still think it's diplomatically possible, but both sides have to start rethinking their relationship with Taiwan and what Taiwan is. And Taiwanese themselves need to think more about what their relation is between China and the rest of the world. Anyway, the point is that the danger, in my view, is this tightening alliance between India, Japan, Australia, backed by the UK and the United States. I think that's a formula for war.
Yeah. And I was just reading how we have a massive war game, the first of its kind, that unites the U.S. Air Force and Space Force, featuring 12,000 troops in operation, 300 aircraft, called the First in a Generation Operation. Strange name. It was just launched on July 10th. Right in China's backyard, also stretching into the Indo-Pacific, all premised on the idea of an inevitable war with China. So I think that, when I hear Rubio speaking a lot of these seemingly constructive words, he's even used words like multipolarity. He's used words like the U.S. has to give up on its aspirations for hegemony, and we have to embrace economic progress. I hear those words, and then I see things. I listen to what you're saying, you guys, and I just look at what the military maneuvers are with AUKUS, and then this ongoing right now, saber rattling right in China's backyard, and it looks bleak in that sense in terms of the thinking. But I guess that sort of reflects the two different opposing, like when Xi Jinping or somebody, when certain people use the word multipolarity, it doesn't always mean the same thing, right? And I think you have the Mearsheimer idea, like you were saying, Hall, of this Hobbesian tension, this idea, right? Versus certain other people will use the term, but when they're thinking about it, they're thinking about an anti-Hobbesian cooperation focus, and they're not compatible, and it confuses people because they hear the words and they're like, oh, all uses of the word are equal. But what do you guys think of that? Of the two opposing concepts of multipolarity, a healthy and a sick one? Do you think I'm off base on that, or are you guys on board with me on that?
I've been battling the concept for ages because I just find it misleading. And
Okay.
but I think you have a point that other people are seeing as a very positive. On the one hand, you're countering United States hegemony, and you're supposedly working together to that goal. But on the other hand, in itself, you're creating conflict by doing so. And that's my problem with the term. And for me, uneven polycentrism implies both cooperation and conflict. It can move in either direction. It's a more neutral kind of term, and it doesn't necessarily imply tensions.
Right.
So,
well, I think it has to do with the fact that the telesocracies function in a way where they try to push the land powers against each other. And I think this is why telesocracies see multipolarity as something where you do exactly that. While these telerocracies or land powers, they see multipolarity as something that involves cooperation, because otherwise you have warfare. And of course, warfare on land is always different to warfare on at sea.
Yeah, or in space increasingly, as we're yeah.
Right, but the tensions arise with the amphibious states that start challenging the thelocracies, the sea states. So that's what China is. It's a continental, I call it a continental continental state moving towards amphibious status with moving from semi-peripheral to core status. It's already pretty much achieved core status. So you have this battle of core states, China, an emerging core state versus the hegemonic United States, and the battle as China emerges as a seafaring nation, an amphibious state from a continental status. And that was the same thing you had between Athens and Sparta to a certain extent, and you can go on down history of different epics. Anyway, that's a whole theoretical discussion. But that's a problem, though, because we are U.S. hegemony is being confronted regionally. Each region is being challenged, and it's impossible for the United States. NATO is predicting a 3-4 front war right now because it can't stretch itself out beyond Europe. And that's why we're in a real dangerous point in history.
Yeah.
Basically, we've focused so much attention on Europe, the United States has totally ignored the rest of the world to its own disgrace. The rise of China was inevitable and needed to be dealt with carefully. You can't contain them. You can't manage them. You have to channel China, work with China. But that means working with China. And
I think
has been not been going in that direction as far as I can tell.
Well, I think very few people were listening to Zbigniew Brzezinski and reading his grand chessboard because he was among the few who understood in a certain sick way what would threaten the general blueprint that he had devoted so many decades to advancing, where he literally said quite explicitly that the only threat to his envisioned New World Order would be some unlikely but possible alliance that could emerge between Russia, China, and Iran. And I think now finally the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese were probably paying attention to that, which is why things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was organized so soon thereafter, and things like the International North-South Transportation Corridor between India and Iran and Russia was organized right there afterwards. But I think it's only now that people in the West are beginning to wake up from their little dance with the drunken party, thinking that they won the world in 1992, to the fact that no, something completely new has emerged. And I wanted to ask you guys this, because China is obviously the economic engine. Without that, the idea of the BRICS as a viable alternative doesn't really work very well. But also Iran has been brought in increasingly into the fold in a very serious strategic way. And what you see there are two different projects. It's an image from the cradle featuring the North-South Transportation Corridor that I just mentioned, with ports in the south of Iran, Bandar Abbas, Chabahar, and then down into India, stretching all the way up until St. Petersburg. And I think even further up through the Arctic, that goes through a very volatile region of Azerbaijan, branches that would also spring off throughout the Caspian on the east side of the Caspian as well. There's branch points that are not featured on this graph, as well as through Turkey. Sub-branches of this major international network of corridors. Also, you have in yellow the East-West, or one of the key arteries of the East-West Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm just wondering here, since Iran has been incorporated into the BRICS, and we have just seen again a very disruptive maneuver on the part of Israel, maybe with the help of certain other forces. Do you guys see this, since Iran plays such an important role in uniting all of these different aspects of Eurasia, do you guys see a big blow having been struck to Iran and the broader strategy? Or do you think that Iran has weathered the storm and these projects are not really at risk at this moment? Drago.
I think it's something in between. They haven't been defeated. Like a lot of the media were presenting, the Israeli and the U.S. strikes as a total domination of the Western style of warfare, which is not true. Most of the Israeli aircraft were not actually flying over Iran. They were sending in drones, and that's why they got shot down. Most of the aircraft that Israel was using against these Iranians, they were firing long-range air-to-ground missiles over Syria and over Iraq, and that's how they managed to hit most of the targets they wanted. But still, that wasn't enough, and they needed the United States to get involved. Trump's move was a rather interesting one. We know that it failed. First of all, I keep saying this. We know it failed because there is no radiation. The uranium that's used in these nuclear reactors is 3.67% enriched uranium, while the one that they had is 60%. So if there was a destruction of all that nuclear fuel, you would have a disaster that would be like 15 times worse than the Chernobyl or Fukushima. But there is no radiation. That means that the areas were not penetrated. These nuclear facilities, specifically the Fordo one. So in essence, Iran wasn't defeated, but it was set back for at least like 7 or 8 months because of many of these facilities were damaged, and they need time to repair them. So Iran got hit more because of the elimination of much of its leadership, especially in the terms of military. And I think this is something they have to work on. On the other hand, Israel also exposed itself as being weak in any sort of a prolonged fight. And I mean, this is expected because a country the size of Israel and a population of 8 million cannot, sustain a warfare of any kind that's going to be longer than a few days or maybe a few weeks against the country of 95 million, which has a massive industrial potential. Especially for the Middle East. So Iran suffered a setback, a serious setback, but I wouldn't call it a defeat. And I think the bigger issue is Azerbaijan, and this is something that's very important because Azerbaijan actually has an alliance with Israel. They have very, very close military ties, and Israel helped the Iranians, helped the Azerbaijanis to take over the Nagorno-Karabakh region where the Armenians used to live. And now I've seen speculation. I can't confirm this, but I've seen some claims that the Israelis actually used the Azeri territory to send in some drones, or at least some people who were used as saboteurs. Azerbaijan is very important also for Turkey's, let's say, pan-Turkic strategy, which is also supported by NATO because NATO would actually gain access to the South Caucasus and the Central Asia region. I think they realize that Azerbaijan is key in this because you can't connect Russia and Iran without Azerbaijan, at least not in terms of a land bridge. But you also need Azerbaijan to move into Central Asia. So and this is part of Turkey's strategy, as I said. I think the Azeris will try to get the best they can get from all sides. But I think it's pretty clear their loyalties are more with the Turks than Iranians or the Russians.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because obviously Azerbaijan has been acting very funny. But before I actually probe into Azerbaijan, because I do have I want to get Hall's thoughts on this as well. What do you think, Hall? I know your essay on U.S. and Israel versus Iran was incredibly. There's so many moving parts that you tied together very elegantly, and I'm going to include a link to your essay in the description box under this video. But you write in it that the danger is that the failure to implement a sustainable peace process in the coming weeks could soon set off an explosion between Israel and Iran, fueled by apocalyptic Christian conservatives and far-right right-wing Zionists versus Iranian Shia millenarists.
Yes.
Sorry, that's a hard one to say. You wrote this just a few days after the 12-day war was concluded, but you made a point that the danger, it's still a spark plug. There's still a lot of kindling. Do you think that we're more or less out of the worst of the fire, or is it as dangerous now, weeks later, than it was when you had written those words?
Well, I see us in at the outset of a series of Balkan-like conflicts like those that preceded World War I. I really don't think we're out of anything. As was just mentioned, Iran has been set back. I don't know how many months. Some people go as high as 2 years. Others go 1 month to 2 weeks. It depends on what you're guessing, but I haven't seen any evidence on one side. But I think they have only been set back, not completely defeated. I think they will focus more. What this war proved from the Iranian point of view is that it could attack a nuclear state directly and not be hit back by nuclear weapons. So the whole concept of strategic deterrence, nuclear deterrence, is undermined by this reality. And in my view, the Iranians will focus on developing drones and more hypersonic missiles that can have a tremendous effect on Israel. So, in my view, this has set up a new arms race. Like every war, we go war in Kosovo, we go the Iraq War, U.S. deployment of missile defenses accompanied by NATO enlargement. All of these forced Russia, China, Iran, and any of the rivals of the United States to start rebuilding their military capabilities. And I think that's what we're moving into, a new arms race. Iran can threaten nuclear weapons, but it won't develop them because it doesn't need them, in my view. If a nuclear weapon would destroy both Israel and the Palestinians who they're claiming to defend. I really find it absurd that they'd want such weapons. That's not needed for their defense. It's needed as more of a ploy to defend a regime than it is for purposes of attack. So I'm very skeptical that this Trump's intervention here has led to any sort of a peace agreement. I think we're on the cups of an arms race. I also think that we need to consider, you've got to give Iran the right to enrich its uranium. That's a basic right. And to what degree you don't want to enriching it to uranium, or Russia has offered to enrich uranium for Iran, if that could help negotiate. There are ways to negotiate this issue. But the point is, you need to bring the states in the whole region together into a common agreement on missiles, hypersonic missiles, etc. You don't do that, you're just going to see a spiraling arms race, and that's going to affect everywhere. And I'll just draw some other points, if I may.
Sure.
The concept of multipolarity really came right after NATO announced enlargement in '94. Russia and China held a conference on multipolarity, I believe, 1 or 2 years later. And I would argue that your IHTC, what's the initials of the pipeline, is the same thing as the Berlin-Baghdad Berlin-Baghdad Railway back in World War I. You have this link that's trying to draw Russia, China, and Iran together. So Iran becomes a linchpin for strategic access to the Persian Gulf and Indian Oceans. That to me was one of the factors that helped start World War I was the British fear of the Berlin-Baghdad railway that was going to Basra, Iraq, and therefore access to the Persian. That would compete with the Suez Canal. So this corridor really opens up a new economic competition for China versus the United States, China and Russia both. So that way it's strategically significant. Now, whether it's going to hold up together or hold together, whether they're going to be able to complete it's another question. But certainly these are the kind of tensions that will continue to bubble until they explode again.
Yeah. Well, so these are sort of these two lines of thought are sort of converging from what Drago is saying and what you're saying. The parallels to the buildup towards World War I are very stark. Even the region of the heartland, the Baku, played a very visceral role within that process. And I'm just going to show two maps because it's going to deal with, again, the topic of Azerbaijan. And I'm gonna circle back later on to some of what you had raised, Hall, because there are questions I still have for you on the specific issue of what can be done to really get some constructive maneuvering going in the wake of I mean, it was bad. I mean, the fact that so many qualified leaders, military leaders in Iran were decapitated, were killed in this little maneuver, and as well as many nuclear scientists. I'm worried in certain ways. But before I ask you more questions on that, here's one image featuring the the Zangezur corridor, which involves pipelines and a variety of other things, but especially pipelines stretching from the oil-rich Caspian Sea in the Baku region all the way through to Turkey and then thence onward to Europe. Stretching from Azerbaijan through Armenia, it doesn't really go into Iran in this program. Iran is sort of iced out, it seems. Russia had some influence over it, and it was hoped that this could be a vital artery of the East-West Belt and Road Initiative, the Middle Corridor. However, there are some weird things going on, and I mean, number two, just to remind people, Azerbaijan is a vital artery. Its stability is key in the success of the international north-south transportation corridor, very similar in spirit to the Berlin to Baghdad railway, as you pointed out. So we had a lot of hope that Azerbaijan was going to behave competently in its own best higher interest. However, we've had some strange activity. Aliyev has had a meeting with his Armenian counterpart, somebody who he's been very antagonistic with in Abu Dhabi. A lot of secrecy around that meeting. Nobody knows what was discussed, but we know it's happening at a strange time when the Western-leaning Armenian government is pushing. Well, I won't even get into that can of worms. But what we do have is that there's been a real threat to the diplomatic relations, the friendly relations that have been built up between Azerbaijan and Russia. And I'm wondering, what are your takes? Why is Azerbaijan behaving this way when they represent? It seems like it's in their interest to simply be a positive player and partner within this emerging Eurasian alliance, and instead we find that they're vectoring towards policies that are benefiting only those who want to disrupt and carve up the entirety of Eurasia, possibly even risking a full-blown world war once again. So, Drago, you brought this up originally, and what's your take? What's going on with Azerbaijan?
It's a great question. It's a billion or $1 trillion question, really, because the governments in that region, especially in Armenia and Azerbaijan, they have conducted some of the most self-defeating policies I've ever seen in my life, especially, the Armenians, like the Pashinyan government, the Pashinyan regime, whatever you want to call it. It has done some things that are like shooting yourself, not in the foot, but pretty much in the stomach or close to the head at least. So now Azerbaijan seems to be doing the same, and I'm not sure whether it's because of their relationship with Israel, and of course, if Israel is involved, of course, the United States is involved as well. So they're either being used as a tool to disrupt the multipolar projects that exist between Russia and China and Iran, or they're just trying to see if they can get a chunk of Iran if the country collapses, because I want to remind people that there are more Azeris living in Iran than in Azerbaijan itself, around 20 million, and the entire northwestern part of Iran is populated by Azeris. It should be noted that the only reason Azerbaijan exists as a country was the Russo-Persian War of 1826, and the fact that the Russians just took over that region from the Persians, and then afterwards the Soviet Union, when it overthrew the Tsarist government, they created the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic, which then became the Republic of Azerbaijan that we know today. So in essence, we see that and of course the Soviets essentially created the Azeri identity and Azeri nationalism because they were considered Turks. Or we can say that they're the descendants of the Seljuk Turks who actually took over most of Persia and later moved into Anatolia. So their connections with Turkey are indisputable. They are Shia, but the secular nature, or mostly secular nature, of the Azeri society means that they're more focused on nationalism than religion. So they don't really care that much about the Shia, branch of Islam as much as they care about their Turkic, descent and their connections with Turkey. And of course, again, as I mentioned before, Turkey's interest of moving into Central Asia also play a role in this case. And this is something that the Israelis actually, support, primarily because it also, changes, or at least it shifts Turkey's attention away from Syria. And of course, that is very beneficial to Israeli interests. So if the Israelis can make sure that Turkey is involved into this pan-Turkic project that moves towards Central Asia, then Turkey is going to be less interested in other processes in the Middle East, especially Syria, which, of course, as I said, is very important for Israeli interests. Because Israel is not happy with just destroying, Assad, but it also wants to maintain a sort of let's say a working relationship, or some would say a neo-colonial relationship with the new government. I'm not sure if I would call it a government, but whatever. That's another can of worms, as you said. So I think we're going to see more of this, especially because NATO will also ensure, or will try to ensure, that the Turkey and Russia are actually on a collision course because of this Central Asian project that Turkey has. Turkey's policies are a volatile mix of political Islam, nationalism, of this pan-Turkic and neo-Ottoman ambitions. For NATO, this is good, because if NATO can move into Central Asia, it is essentially one-upping both Russia and China, and actually also Iran, because they're jeopardizing Russia's soft underbelly, and they're also getting behind China's back in the area that borders Xinjiang, and also you're getting to the northern areas of northern borders of Iran. So if they can move into Central Asia, it's a way to essentially like stun lock the multipolar project.
Hall, do you agree with that, or would you add anything to?
Well, I had that. I was in Armenia just after Azerbaijan took Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's quite clear to me that the purpose of that is to disrupt Armenian relations with the CSTO, to break up the CSTO as much as possible, weaken it, and weaken the confidence of the security agreements between Russia and its allies. So that's the first step. In terms of, yes, and I agree, Azerbaijan has influence in Iran, and the ultimate project of Israeli regime change, in my view, it doesn't care about democracy. It really cares more about breaking up the country and supporting. It's not just Azerbaijan. It's supporting the Kurds, and the Baluchis are also fomenting movements of independence both inside and outside Iran. And therefore, instability in Iran creates a whole new level of conflict that I don't think the West has been thinking about in the long run, because you have an independent Kurdistan, or the Kurds are probably one of the more militant groups inside Iran. But of course, you don't know, they're at least the group that's been vehemently repressed up until now, and Azeris as well. But the Baluchis affect Pakistan as well, and so you have a reciprocal, various tendencies of Iran will affect the entire region. So I'm really worried that this whole project of regime change, which the Israelis will pursue, I think, regardless of what the Americans say, will further destabilize the region, and that's why I'm saying that the conflict is still isn't over yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that you brought that issue up as well. The Balkanization idea of Baluchistan, Kurdistan have been manipulated. I think that there's also some ethno-national groups, separatist groups in Russia that
Right.
Azerbaijan has, it seems that they've been behind, or at least helping to grow certain groups that are seen as threats to the stability of Russia. So that's certainly part of the game plan. It always has been divide to conquer. I still don't quite understand, but I mean, that's not, I'm not expecting to get a full answer. Like, what is it that that's ultimately animating the policy thinking of Azerbaijan? Since, if Turkey even gets their way, they're ultimately going to encounter many conflicts with the Azeri government in their ambition for greater a neo-Ottoman empire that involves expanding into Russia, taking up a big chunk of Azerbaijan and Iran. Like, there's going to be all sorts of conflicts that they're just walking into. So that's part of the game, I suppose, getting short-sighted people to act myopically for money or whatever else.
I mean, if you can use a country, to pretty much sacrifice itself to further your interest, then why not? That this is at least the way of thinking of the empire that wants to ensure that it can disrupt all these processes that we're talking about. And as far as the Azeris, they actually have not just influence over certain minorities in Russia, but they also have a very very strong mafia within Russia that has certain influence over in various regions of Russia. And the Russians actually are working on dismantling this, but it's very difficult because this goes back all the way to the Soviet Union when Haidar Aliyev, who is actually the father of the current president, when he established his connections with various KGB, outposts across the former Soviet Union, and then when the country collapsed, these connections remained in place, and then they were pretty much integrated with the Azeri mafia. So Azerbaijan actually has a pretty wide reach in Russia and even in Ukraine, in some other countries in the former Soviet Union.
Right, and that's been a big point that I think you even brought this up in your. It might have been you who brought this up, Hall, in one of your writings that that Azerbaijan has been supporting Ukraine while Iran has been supporting Russia, militarily speaking. So you have these points of conflict, but I'm wondering as well within this context. And I mean, Israeli intelligence plays some very very nefarious roles all over the place. We've found evidence that Azerbaijan territory was utilized in some of the attacks against Iran by Israel. There's evidence that's been documented online by various geopolitical experts and even diplomats. But
Well,
yep.
No, no. Go ahead. Just before the Iran war started, Iran had already attacked ISIS in Syria, Kurdish positions that they claimed were Israeli outposts in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, and posts in Baluchistan and Pakistan. So it was engaging in a three-front war without Israel at that time. Well, it was engaging with Israel with the Hezbollah and all that, but the war was already emerging before it broke out more vicious.
Right. So let me actually just shift gears basically, because one thing that's been sort of hovering over my mind has been the fact that in true Orwellian fashion, the definitions of what terrorism is have changed in front of our eyes. All of a sudden, al-Nusra, Julani, whatever his new name is, I keep forgetting, is now all of a sudden off of the terrorist list. They're now normalized in the minds of at least of mainstream media consuming Americans. They're now a legitimate country, no longer head choppers. And in turn, I would imagine that a deal was cut whereby Julani announced that the Golan Heights, a big chunk of that, can be given over to Israel, along with like 3 other buffer zones. That what are the implications, and what are the general? What is the planning and thinking from Israeli American geopolitical planners who are trying to game this out? What is the strategy of expanding the influence of Julani's sort of now normalized Al-Qaeda, which is our enemy or our ally? All of a sudden, it was our enemy. Al-Qaeda was the big threat to the United States and freedom, and now all of a sudden it's our ally against Iran. What's the thinking behind this, Drago?
Well, I mean, I would say that the Al Qaeda was never the enemy of the United States, and it's interesting. Professor Josudowski actually has a very very interesting theory. I mean, it's not just a theory. He presented pretty solid evidence about this. The word Al Qaeda actually means database. In Arabic, it means the database, and it was the database of the CIA of their database of the Mujahideen that they were supporting in Afghanistan, and then they pretty much used these people to establish terrorist cells all around the world, and then you fight, the global war on terror. I mean, it's interesting. You have the United States starts the global war on terror and global war on poverty and global war on drugs, and wherever these wars start, you have more of all these things. So it's pretty clear that the Al Qaeda and ISIS and all these other similar organizations were used to overthrow countries. So we've never had the Syrian civil war. Just like we didn't have the Yugoslav civil wars. This was an invasion that was presented as a civil war. So Al-Safra or Al-Julani, whatever the hell his name is, we don't even know who the guy is, really. He's just a neo-colonial governor of the conquered territory of Syria. And the fact that he just gave away the Golan Heights after 60 years of Syria refusing to do that goes to show that that's true. And we know before the overthrow of Assad, we know that the Israelis were actually working with the ISIS, and there were even videos of Israeli helicopters bringing in ISIS, terrorists back into Israel, where they were treated in Israeli hospitals and then brought back to Syria. And of course, the U.S. bases at Al-Tam also played a major role in that. So Syria has been carved up. We see that there are diverging interests within the coalition that brought down Syria, namely between Turkey and Israel. This has actually gone to the point that the Israelis actually support the idea of Russian troops staying in Latakia and Khmeim, as long as they are going to prevent the Turks from moving closer to Israel. So it's a very, very complex situation. We have these cross-cutting alliances. We have countries that have diverging and converging interests. You would probably never expect the Russians and the Israelis to have any converging interests, but this happened in Syria in that regard. On the other hand, the former allies of Israel and Turkey have become sort of like frenemies now, because they have these conflicting interests of how Syria and how its future is going to look like. Turkey actually wants to maintain the territorial integrity of Syria because it wants to take all of it pretty much, and Israel wants to make sure that it has control over various regions, and also wants to continue having relations with the Kurds. So as long as they can keep controlling this sort of like create like this sort of controlled chaos, it's good for them. And Turkey wants to establish some kind of stability because it wants to control and exploit the entire country of Syria, whatever is left of it.
Mm-hmm. Paul, what do you agree with that?
Simply say that alliances shift. Al-Qaeda was definitely on the American side in the war in Afghanistan when the United States was building up a Sunni alliance against the Soviets, and also a Sunni alliance against Iran simultaneously. At that time, Al-Qaeda was more or less on the American side, but September 11th, the Iraq War and other factors, I think Al-Qaeda was against us, and then finally Al-Qaeda would shift its position later on, but it isn't so black and white on being one side or the other. And I also reminded that George Washington, Menachem Begin, you could go down the list of men in history that were considered terrorists, suddenly became Nelson Mandela, who suddenly became heroes and internationally respected leaders. So this kind of shift in international politics goes on all the time. So it didn't surprise me that the former al-Nusra leader would become the respected leader of Syria in this circumstance. But I do agree that he's under a thumb of both. He's squished between Turkey and Israel, and really doesn't know which way to move, and requires Turkish support to keep him functioning. And the Russians still have interests there; they haven't disappeared. And anyway, I could go on and on about it, but the point is that terrorism has two faces. It could switch one way or another depending. Yeah. We still don't know if there are any states behind the Al-Qaeda attacks in 2001. I mean, Saudi Arabia has been accused, but who knows if some other state was behind it. The whole idea that it was a so-called non-governmental organization. What a farce. It was an anti-state organization that was probably manipulated or used to some extent by someone else. We don't know. Well, we'll probably out 100 years from now. Anyway, so
there are certain things that must not be said in polite society if you want to keep your job.
Yeah.
So the Abraham Accords, obviously, the way I've seen it is that they're just like we were talking about multipolarity having different meanings to different people. I saw something similar to within how different people were talking about the Abraham Accords, with some maybe more naive, but perhaps, but I think generally honest problem-solving analysts looking at it and trying to think, well, how can you possibly cut through these Gordian knots that is the region of Israel, the Middle East in general, and looking at it from the standpoint of a not such a Hobbesian thing, but rather based upon an idea of Shia and Sunni nations working together to recognize Israel, but also to build up, to restore the idea, the dream of a two-state solution that Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat had moved pretty nicely in that direction in the 90s before that was sabotaged, based on economic cooperation, mutual respect. There was that idea of it, but then there's this other more common application of the Abraham Accords that involves what Kissinger said was so great about it, which is the idea of pitting the Sunni nations against pretty much Iran and other Shia nations, but mostly Iran, in alliance with Israel. Now, in your minds, do you think that there is any viability of a constructive? I know Saudi Arabia has been toying with trying to sort of cater to both the East as well as the West, walking sort of in two different worlds. UAE is a full member of the BRICS. Egypt is a full member of the BRICS. Iran. Do you see a possibility of a sort of healthy pathway towards a two-state solution and the Abraham Accords playing a positive role within that? Or do you think that is a complete trap that should just be avoided at all costs right now? And what do you think that Giuliani and the new Syria, what role would they play in that if they were allowed to be incorporated into such a discussion?
Interesting.
Hall, I'll start with you on that one.
Okay. Actually, I think it's very important for Trump to begin immediately to get out of this Gaza Riviera concept and start thinking about what a practical two-state solution, in which keeps the Palestinians on their own lands and gives them ownership over the whole state. I would argue it would have to be a demilitarized state. Hamas, individual members of Hamas might be part, but Hamas would have to be dissolved. But you could set up new political leaderships. Maron Baroudi in Israeli prison. There's a number of people have been listed as potential new leaders of such a state that could be acceptable to all sides. So I think the point is that you need a new approach that really develops, and that way you can cut the Iranians out, not totally, but at least indirectly. Say we're going to work on this state. We're going to get the Saudis involved, and that will help enhance Saudi-Israeli ties. The whole thing should have been done ages ago when it was actually promised, both in the 1990 war. To get the world into the war in Iraq, they promised a Palestinian statehood. The same thing for the 2003 war, to get states to support that. A Palestinian statehood was promised, the two-state solution was promised, and it's never happened. So bringing that into fulfillment after three more wars is really should be a major focus of the Trump administration. I know they've talked about it, but the way they talk about it just seems so disrespectful of the Palestinians and who have just. It's a democide. I don't like the term genocide, but it's a democide that's going on there, and the place needs to be totally reconstructed and a state, a demilitarized state, I really think is a possibility. So I hope that answers the question. And for me, the whole Arab community should play a role. They're the ones in the past anyway have supported the Palestinians on different sides. And certainly the Saudis proposed the two-state solution back in 2002, and those proposals really haven't changed much and over the more than 20 years that have passed. But getting Israel, as long as Netanyahu's in there, I just don't see this happening. He's really, in my view, the part of the reason where we got in this war in the beginning was his adamant opposition to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear accord. He got Trump along with him to denounce the accord. That was the first initial step towards the isolation of Iran and the conflict. So in many ways, Netanyahu and Trump are both responsible for the outbreak of this recent conflict. But now they have to, like I said before, politics always shifts faces, and now having practically destroyed Gaza and invading the West Bank, Israel and needs to work with the Americans and with the Arab countries, the Gulf countries in particular, to establish a Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that, Drago? Do you think that the Abraham Accords could have a positive sort of reform or approach to it, or do you think that it needs to be rethunk completely?
Well, I mean, I think the Arab states need to reconfigure their sovereignty if it exists at all. I agree with what Professor Gardner said. The problem is Israel doesn't want this two-state solution, and they've proven it time and again. During the 2007 conflict in Gaza between the Fatah and Hamas, Israel actively supported Hamas, knowing full well that they are, the more extreme faction. And, the only reason why you would want to do that is you want the extremists to be in power to, have an excuse to bomb the place back to Stone Age, pretty much. And we also saw that during this October 7th attack when, if Israel can bomb Iran and if it can know, which buildings or even parts of buildings to hit in Tehran to kill scientists, I'm pretty sure they know everything that's going on in Gaza. So it's impossible for me to imagine they didn't know about the attack. They let it happen, and then you have an excuse to just level the place. And I think that's what happened. And I think every single time, if there's like a moderate Palestinian government of any kind, whether it's in Gaza or in West Bank or wherever else, they're going to make sure it's replaced by extremists who are then going to be bombed back to Stone Age. And I see that these Arab nations are not doing anything about it. They're not, doing anything to help the Palestinians in any meaningful way. And on top of that, we see that many of these Arab countries are actually allied to Israel, because the Jordanian military was actually shooting down Iranian drones and missiles and cruise missiles specifically that were flying towards Israel. So I mean, it's pretty clear that Israel pretty much runs the geopolitical aspect of the entire Middle East, and it's going to continue, especially, because the United States is still dominant in most of these Arab countries, especially now that Syria, as the last independent Arab country, has fallen since last year.
Mm-hmm. There's a Hall, you had mentioned something regarding the possibility of regime change in Israel in your recent essay, and
that's what I was about to say.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of maneuvers. There's been a lot of pressure. Netanyahu has been walking a very fine line, and sort of his political
there have been massive protests against his government for 8 years, and the war is being used to keep him in power. So his reckoning is about to come, in my view. But you remember Trump just intervened and said, "Oh, no, the legal cases against Netanyahu should be dumped." Well, okay, fine, dump them, and then ask him to step down from power in exchange for clemency. That's one possibility. Now, just him though, he has an alliance, so I don't know enough about the dynamics of Israeli internal politics to determine who might come out on top. If it won't necessarily be a good guy. So I don't know, but the point is, Netanyahu at least symbolizes this militancy, and I agree. Israel did almost everything to block the moderate Arabs from gaining any kind of power and letting Fatah win in the conflict over Gaza at that time. They even blocked application to UNESCO. It was totally absurd. Anyway, the point is that a new approach, and the Americans have to get behind it. As long as they're not behind it, it won't happen. I agree with you that. But the point is, I believe that American policy will change, and I believe that it is possible to change the U.S. attitude towards Israel.
There's been a former Israeli intelligence figure whose name is escaping me, who had bragged that Israeli intelligence had found a way to infiltrate most layers of the Iranian establishment. And I wonder sometimes when I hear remarks like that, and I know there's some braggadocio, some psyops going on, but at the same measure, there was a coordinated assassination program beginning with Raisi last year, and the defense minister taken down right very close to the borders of Azerbaijan in a helicopter, all the way up through I think maybe more than 24 leading military officials in Iran that were taken out a few weeks ago. I wonder sometimes if certain figures might have been spared who are less than trustworthy. And I listened to the Tucker Carlson interview with the Iranian president, and it was good. He spoke well, I found. But I wonder, do you guys think that there's any chance that certain closet Iranian Gorbachevs could be lurking about, acting on the surface as patriots, but in under the surface preparing to weaken or pull the plug from the Iranian nation as it has been known since 1979? Do you guys, is that a concern for you guys, or is that not really too much of an issue? Whoever wants to jump on that bomb, go for it.
Professor?
Well, I'd like to believe there are. There has been a vibrant civil society movement protesting against the regime for years, and individual leaders have spoke up. The Green Movement and some other women's movements, they've spoken up, but they've been pretty much severely repressed. But they do have secret supporters inside the Iranian establishment. The problem is the Revolutionary Guards, and their cut. The rest of they're cut over Iranian society and how much power they control, and therefore I worry that when the Ayatollah dies, you're going to have one Iranian told me that there's a saying that Ayatollahs die in their sleep suddenly. When the pressure is not necessarily because they're about to die, but they suddenly disappear in their sleep. The point is that you don't know who's going to pop out of the next the bunch. There are apparently 3 names listed. I don't know all 3 of them. I don't know their political perspective, but that just the choosing of whoever it is could create a conflict with the Iranian guards, Revolutionary Guards, as well as other groups within society. So you could have a civil war, and that's really a concern. I think they need somebody who can federate. Gorbachev used that example. I don't really think we're going to get Gorbachev, but you never know. Someone who can federate and speak up in a solid voice and reach compromises with the U.S. and Israel, and as well as Saudi Arabia. So you need a real leadership. And
do you think that there's any
out so many, and who knows who the Israelis killed? I just can't tell you who's going to pop out of the hat.
Do you think that there's any closet monarchists in political power or near political power in Iran? Or I know that outside, like I was just in Montreal where I live, there's a lot of Iranians, and I saw some protests during the period of strike sharing between Israel and Iran, and I thought that these were protests. They were protests with Iranian flags featuring Iranian people, and I was thinking that it was a stop the war, stop Israel type of thing. I looked over, and it was all about overthrow the Iranian government, restore the Shah, and I was like, "What? How is this? How are you thinking?" And I realized how. Huh?
No, both the Mek, the pro-Shah, son of the Shah, and the Mek, People's Revolutionaries have financial. John Bolton spoke at a Mek conference, People's Mujahideen conference. You can find it on YouTube. I don't think it's a fake. And he, at the end of his speech, he praised the eventual regime change. I mean, that was his. Here we have the National Security Advisor of the United States aligning himself with what's considered a terrorist group. As I said, I assume it was a real thing and not a fake. But the point is that there are groups that have money that are aligning and certainly have followers inside the country ready to act when the moment arises. But the regime is so repressive at the moment. I don't see that moment occurring. And in fact, I could even argue that the bombing of Iran by the United States helped solidify the people. Remember, Khomeini survived because Saddam Hussein was urged to attack Iran by the United States and the UK in the 1980s in a horrible war. The Iranians have gone through hell since this revolution, and who knows which way they'll move. But if they see the Americans and Israel as an enemy, they'll support whatever regime comes out of this. So right. I'm really worried that this is another step towards disaster.
Did you have any thoughts you wanted to toss in there on that one, Drago?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a very good analysis of what's going on there. I just want to point out Pezeshkian is an Azeri. So for those who don't know, he's an Azeri, I presume of Armenian descent because his last name that suggests that. Right. Many of the Azeris who live in northwestern Iran were actually Turkified Armenians. And the interesting thing is in the 1930s, when Turkey was during the rule of the Ataturk, many people who had last names that were sounding either Greek or Armenian or Persian, they were forced to change their names to sound more Turkish. Well, this is something that didn't happen in Iran because obviously Iran is a different country. So this is why you have a lot of these, let's say, people whose heritage you can trace based on their last names. But the whole point is, I made a digression there. The whole point is, Pezeshkian is an Azeri. He's of Azeri ethnicity, and he also calls himself an Azeri Turk. So, I'm not claiming that he's not loyal to the Iranian government or the Iranian state. However, obviously, it's obvious that he has a different nationality to what most Iranians are. So, it's questionable what his loyalties are. And he was already touted as a liberal candidate in comparison to others. I think it's pretty clear that Israel wanted to conduct these mass decapitation strikes against Iran since the moment Iran actually came too close to pretty much surround Israel. So, this was I think one of the major issues between Russia and Iran. So the Russians, when they moved into Syria, they didn't have the goal of going after Israel. They just wanted to, sweep all the terrorists in Syria and ensure that their bases are safe. On the other hand, Iran wanted to use Syria as a base of operation against Israel. So in the end, Israel decided to go on a full-scale strategic, counteroffensive of some kind, and then launched all these decapitation strikes against Hezbollah, against Syria, against Iran itself in the end. And the results have been, pretty much a strategic defeat for Iran because most of its so-called axis of resistance have been neutralized after this. The problem with Iran is that they haven't really, made sure that all these pro-Israeli or pro-U.S. spies and intelligence assets within Iran are removed because for those who don't know, the Safak or Savak, which was the Iranian intelligence service during the Shah, was actually trained by the U.S. and Israel, and these people have remained in place. I mean, they weren't completely replaced by the pro Khomeini assets, and many of them pretty much played the role of sleeper agents within Iran, and they were reactivated, whenever it was necessary to kill scientists or, to assassinate political figures or anyone who was seen as a threat to Israel or the United States.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's something that's been on my mind a lot. And, just like you had Operation Gladio utilizing unreconstructed Nazis and fascists that remained as sleeper cells, acting as patriots of various nations on the surface, but actually leading figures who should have been probably executed at Nuremberg were actually given very powerful new employment by Alan Dulles, by British intelligence, and managed an international paramilitary institution in the form of these secret armies affiliated with NATO, some of whom ended up running, the Bundeswehr for many years. So we have here something that I think a lot of people have been avoiding, and I've noticed many people who champion multipolarity, they kind of gloss over this fact that there have been stay-behinds tied to the Savak, which was never a trustworthy thing, that have not exited over the last 40 years Iran or its broader deep state operations. So it's a concern that I have, and I hope that that wiser people in positions to do something about it have a good mapping and know how to like contain this problem. But it's not been proven to me yet that that's the case. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that the intelligentsia of Iran and Eurasia more generally have a game plan to deal with this.
I couldn't agree more. I just wanted to point out, that, we have evidence. It's circumstantial, but the evidence is pretty solid because the operatives that were used by the Mossad against, people in Iran were Persian speaking. Like these are people who are locals. They're not, they weren't sent from Israel, to infiltrate. They are from the area. They know the local dialects. They know the local languages because Iran has, various nationalities. So these people are locals who are working for Mossad. So that means they were there, since ever, pretty much.
Yeah, right. No, exactly. And just looking at these various, like, the Mujahideen, Ikalk, the MEK operations. You have so many different groups that have been given sponsorship by the West. It's definitely a lot to keep in mind. Generally speaking, Pezeshkian was optimistic, though. He kept he pissed off a lot of the hardliners in his interview with Tucker Carlson last week, but I think it was responsible statecraft in making the point that Iran is always willing and has proven that it is acting in good faith to be a part of renewed nuclear talks and to participate in any constructive way. They've signed on. He made the point that they're signers of the non-proliferation agreement and have been very obedient to it, that Iran has never even been caught murdering, in any court case anywhere in the world. Iran has not been, caught supporting terrorism, even though they're labeled as the international sponsor of global terrorism. It's actually been something more closely aligned with what Bolton represents and Zbigniew Brzezinski represents that has been behind it. But that being said, he did make a point that Iran is always willing to talk and to get back to the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations. Do you think, Hall, and then I guess we'll slowly wrap it up, but do you think that that it's viable at this point? I mean, we know that the IAEA has proven itself to be untrustworthy, or at least members of people within the IAEA have been rather untrustworthy, possibly even giving Israel access to information about the whereabouts and locations of nuclear scientists and operations, as well as just pushing propaganda, global international propaganda, to make it appear in the days before Iran was attacked by Israel. The IAEA was saying that Iran was acting in bad faith. So should they go back to the table and the discussion table and cooperate with the IAEA? Is that even a viable thing at this point, or what's your take?
Oh, they've suspended. They haven't cut out entirely, as far as I understand. And suspended means that the IAEA itself will have to revamp its own policies towards Iran and send in a new team and at least eliminate people that are suspect if they go back into the country in the future. So I'm not totally pessimistic about the possibility of talks, but talks that bring back the inspections. But I really think it has to be a regional issue. The problem is Israel didn't sign the NPT. Israel's nuclear facilities are. Even India, which has nuclear weapons, not a member of the NPT, is inspected in according to an agreement with the United States. So the point is, the idea that Israel can be totally free and Iran can't is already a contradiction that is just considered unfair. So trying to bring an international court that, as I point out in my paper, that looks at a universal enrichment inspections, at least revitalize that might be one way to go. Another way, I wish Israel would give up its nuclear weapons. It claims it doesn't have any, but I think Olmert slipped that Israel had, and other leaders have kind of admitted having. One idea is to have a no first use of any kind of weapons of mass destruction for the entire Middle East region. That way, you can at least begin to put the missile conflict, missile race under control, and the weapons of mass destruction rates, because there's also chemical weapons and biological weapons that have been threatened to be used in the region. So the point is, there are ways to begin negotiations, but as I say, they really have to be on a regional, and they also have to deal with the Palestinian question. So we need a really big project. You really need to look at it and sit down, just as the conferences that occurred after World War I, and begin to an international conference that really begins to settle all the major questions. And that you need real leadership, and you need leadership on the American side that trusts in international cooperation. And that's what we don't have in the United States at the present moment, when the rest of the world is calling for at least multilateralism. I don't like the term multipolarity, but multilateral approaches to the Middle East are absolutely essential. You can't solve anything without working with the states in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So I go on and on, but the point is, without an international conference, or without an American leadership that has the vision to move in that direction, this war will continue. It will not end at present. It is just a truce in a larger conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it didn't take. It was only a matter of 2 weeks for Bretton Woods to take effect, for a completely new financial architecture to emerge onto the scene. So we could see what could happen when people have some qualified leadership that care about the future. It could be done again. The crisis is in no way smaller today than it was in 1944. In many ways, it's much larger. There's more people. The speculative bubbles are much larger, and the pain that will be felt with the collapse of this kind of banking system could be said to be much, much greater. So, of course, the need is much higher, and I think you're right. Some form of emergency conference should take place. Now, Drago, I guess I'll end this with you. Trump had said early on, after taking office, that between the USA and China, that the world's problems could be solved between these two powers working together. He said those words. Now, it didn't necessarily pan out that the U.S. has necessarily acted in good faith, in my assessment so far, to back up and support those very, very correct words. But do you think that there is a chance that there is a sane nationalist power within the USA that could participate, if it nothing else, be dragged into such a constructive dialogue for a new security economic architecture for the coming generations? Or do you think that, for lack of a better way of putting it, the rod is, or the gangrene is too deep set? And what's your take? Are you an optimist, or are you vectoring on the negative?
I certainly hope that the first is true, and that the second is not. But I mean, it's a really tough question. I was really hopeful that Trump is going to be different. I didn't expect anything groundbreaking, but I didn't think that he's going to drown in the swamp so fast. But it seems to me that I'm not sure if he's playing some sort of 5D chess, or that he's completely on board with the swamp. Because I mean, he kept saying that he's going to drain the swamp, and now he's drowning in it. Or at least that's what that's the impression that I have. These warmongers are a danger to everyone, including the American people. And I think this is something that we need to, it's a very simplistic, form, but I think it's important to point it out for the sake of the Americans themselves and the rest of the world, because the United States cannot fight a multi-vectored conflict with everyone. It's completely self-defeating, because the U.S. is doing the opposite of what was done during the 70s, when very, very potent and capable diplomats such as Kissinger were sent to China, to pretty much widen the Sino-Soviet split. We don't see that anymore. We see that America's policies are only strengthening the Eurasian monolith that we see today. Simultaneous attacks against Russia, China, and Iran are only going to strengthen their alliance, despite differences, in their geopolitical approach and in their internal systems and so on. It has pushed Eurasia into an unprecedented alliance, and there is just no way that the U.S. can match the resources and power of Eurasia. Even NATO itself cannot match those resources and power. Russia alone has nuclear weapons to defeat the entire world, pretty much. And the same goes for the United States. But if you push together Russia and China and a regional power like Iran, and then there's also North Korea, which shouldn't be ignored. I really don't see how this could lead to anything positive for the United States. It can only end in the United States being isolated at some point and then destroyed piecemeal or destroyed from within, because it's obvious that they're not going to attack the United States directly, but they were trying to invest into breaking apart the United States itself from within. And because there's no other way to defeat, just like the Soviet Union, collapsed because somebody from the outside wanted to exploit the internal divisions, because it was impossible to defeat a country like the Soviet Union militarily. Just like the United States itself is impossible to be defeated militarily, you have to try to break it apart from the inside if you're an adversary of the United States. So Trump is only going to help those who want to destroy America if he continues along this path. Now, again, as I said, I'm not sure if this is just like some sort of a 5D chess where he's trying to one up the deep state and then, just suddenly change policy when he gets enough power, or he's just, on board with whatever they're doing. I guess we need more time to know what his exact goal is. I sure as hell hope it's the first hypothesis you presented.
Yeah, I fingers crossed. I mean, like I said, it's there were some very positive remarks and maneuvers that Trump had made in his first term, where he called for a U.S., Russia, China alliance. Policy-wise, he had made certain maneuvers on Arctic development that would involve an open cooperation with Russia on developing new corridors mutually that tie into the polar Silk Road of China. So there was a lot of reason, and still is, I think, that evidence still is something I hold inside of my heart as a hope that there is this more subtle long-term strategy floating above the crazy talk. But I don't know. I'm still information gathering too. So I appreciate you just giving me your assessment. I definitely appreciate that. And Hall, I'll throw it at you for the last question, or not the last question, but final thoughts, Hall. What do you want us to leave off with?
Tomorrow night, what kind of address he makes about the new approach to Russia. I'm assuming, and I hope I'm wrong, that he's going to take a new a neoconservative approach, a new sanctions approach, a new pressure and containment approach, not just on Russia, China, but Iran as well, which I agree will strengthen those countries, bring them closer together, as opposed to breaking them apart. In my view, the only way to deal with this is to begin a real engagement, diplomatic engagement with Russia, China, and Iran, and begin to resolve these problems. Simply military buildup and creating a great golden dome defense and other fabrications won't resolve the crisis, the immediate crisis. It won't resolve the economic crisis that you alluded to, but that are increasing debts, both public and private, and deal with the larger crisis of a real possibility of major power war. So I'm really afraid that World War Trump could be the result of his policies, as I argued back in his first term, if he doesn't really reassess where he's going. Now, as I said, if he's just playing games and switching back and forth, maybe there'll come something will change, because he can change the next day. So, but the point is, that's the point where he has to be consistent in his policy application if we're going to resolve any of these crises that are beginning to interlink and overwhelm.
Gentlemen, I think that this was a very sobering way to start our Sunday, or end our Sunday, depending on where on this globe you might happen to be located when you're watching this thing. I appreciate both of you so much for sharing your wisdom, your insights, your considerations, and I look forward to meeting up with everybody here on Pluralia Dialogos in 2 weeks' time, same channel. Share. One thing I really am going to implore people who are watching this is subscribe and share this link so we can really get the word out and build up the viewership and get these conversations to go much more viral. The last thing too, for those who also want to take part in the Rising Tide Foundation, weekly lecture that happens right after this, send me an email through canadianpatriot.org or risingtidefoundation.net, and I'll give you all the information on how to take part in our regular Sunday lectures at 2 p.m. New York time. And again, thank you guys so much, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Excellent discussion.
Yeah.
Really.
Couldn't agree more.